All right, folks, we're going to do a little bit of review. This is going to be kind of a longer video for finding function rules and using function rules to find outputs. So we'll go ahead. This is kind of an opener we did during lesson 20, so you can use it as a review here. You could even open that up on your iPad later and try it and then check your work against mine. Okay, so I'm looking at my rule, output equals -4 times input plus 5. -4 right next to parentheses means times. So I'm going to go ahead and start working with this. So this says whatever the input is, multiply it by a -4 and then add 5. So I'm going to write that out in this fashion. So I see the input of 2 here. I'm going to write -4, I'll make -4 times the input plus 5. Now, in this case, I know what the input is. It says here that the input is 2, so I can replace my input here with 2 quite magically. And so then I just do -4 times 2 is -8, plus 5 is -3. I just calculate it out, and I get my output. This is sort of a rinse and repeat thing here. So instead of 2 on this next one, I have an input of -4, so the input spot gets taken place by -4 plus 5. So -4 times -4 is positive 16 plus 5 is 21. All right, we'll keep going here. -4 times, and then the input in this case is 0 plus 5. -4 times 0 is 0 plus 5 is 5. All right, last one, -4 times 4.5 should be old hands at it by now. 4.5 times 4 is 18. It's going to be negative, plus 5 is -13. All right, so again, you just follow what the rule says using the order of operations, multiply by -4, and then add 5. When we need to find a rule, the process gets a little bit more complicated. We have to use a guess and check method. So what I tend to do is I look at the 0 row first. The reason I look at the 0 row first is that it tells me how much I'm adding or subtracting. So in order to go from 0 to 0, I have to add 0. I'm not adding or subtracting anything. So that means that my rule for this table cannot involve any addition. All right, so I have plus 0. So now I have to rely on multiplication, maybe squaring or cubing or square rooting or something like that. So the first thing that comes to mind, I'm noticing that when I look at 5 and 10, it's an easy sort of relationship. I see like sort of 2 times 5, but I also notice that it's -10, not +10, which means I need to multiply by -2. So I'm going to try that on the other ones. -2 times -3. Negative and a negative make a positive. 2 times 3 is 6, so that works. Remember, it has to work for every single row. -2 times 4 is -8. That works. -2 times 0 is 0. And since adding 0 doesn't really do anything, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that part, and I can then write my rule. And when you write your rule, what you can notice is that there are several things that are in every single row here. -2 times is in every single row, which means that has to be a part of the universal process. -2 times, and then I have a set of things that are changing here. I have 5, then -3, then 4, then 0, and those come straight from my input column. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking -2 times my input. And there's my rule. I made sure it worked for every single row in the table. I looked at the stuff that stayed the same in every single row in terms of the process, and that became a part of my rule. Then I noticed the stuff that changed in my process, and that became the input in my rule. All right, let's move on to the next one. So again, I'm going to scan over here to see if there's a 0 row, and it certainly is. Here it is right here. And that tells me that the only way to go from 0 to 5 is to add 5. So I must be adding 5 in my process. That has to be there. And so now I just have to consider if there's any multiplication, squaring, or anything else. And so what I'm going to notice is that 3 plus 5 is 8, and 7 plus 5 is 12, -4 plus 5 is 1, and 0 plus 5 is 5. So This one is just an addition rule. By identifying the addition in the 0 row, I found out the whole rule. So let's think the way that we did last time. There's a bunch of stuff that changes. I have 3, 7, negative 4, 0, and that comes from my input. So I'll write input here. And then there's a bunch of stuff that stays the same in every single process, and it is plus 5, so that has to be a part of my rule. All right, let's keep going. Okay, things are going to get a little bit more complicated here. I found a 0 row here, and that tells me that I'm not adding anything. So there's no addition or subtraction in this because 0 plus 0 is 0. So I have to rely on squaring, maybe division, multiplication, something like that. So let's kind of look at the relationships here. I have to get from 15 to 5, negative 30 to 10, 9 to 3. 9 to 3 kind of is a good hint for me because I know my 3's. I know to go from 9 to 3, you have to divide by 3. So I'm going to try that out on the other ones. I'm just guessing and checking here. Negative 30 divided by 3 is negative 10. That works. 15 divided by 3 is 5. And 0 divided by 3 is 0. So let's get rid of the stuff that's unimportant. Plus 0, I don't need it. Let's highlight those things that change. There's 15, negative 30, 9, and 0. And then there's some stuff that is in every single process row. The divide by 3 is there every single time. So that tells me that I take my input and I divide by 3 because that divide by 3 shows up in every single process row. All right, so if you didn't see that at first, that's okay. You can keep on trying until you get it. That's the point of some of these problems. Okay, so let's look at this last one. Again, hopefully you're guessing. I'm going to go to the 0 row right away, and that tells me there's going to be minus 2 in my rule because 0 minus 2 is negative 2. Okay, so then I have to decide what else is going on here because 3 minus 2 is not 13, so something else is happening. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use gray here because it's just a scratch here. So what I know is that 15 minus 2 is 13, and 5 minus 2 is 3, and negative 20 minus 2 is negative 22. So when I'm thinking about those now, the question is, how do I go from 3 to 15 using multiplication or squaring or division or something like that? And so what I know is that each one of these numbers is a multiple of 5. And in fact, 3 times 5 is 15. 1 times 5 is 5, and negative 4 times 5 is negative 20. So I'm going to get rid of my scratch here, and I'm going to replace it with a process. I'm going to do 5 times 3, 5 times 1, and 5 times negative 4. All right, so I have something that seems like it's working. 5 times 3 minus 2 is 13. 5 times 1 minus 2 is 3. 5 times negative 4 minus 2 is negative 22. And 5 times 0 minus 2 is negative 2. So let's do that helpful highlighting. Stuff that is in every single process row is here. That leaves some things that are changing. And so I guess I could have been color coding this all along. So 5 times minus 2, and the thing that's changing is the input. So 5 times the input minus 2 has to be our rule. So that's sort of the basics. There are some more complex things that we're going to ask you to do that maybe involve squaring or division by x, or maybe even stuff that is an exponential relationship. And we'll post another video that can help you out with that. But at this point, you need to be able to master the linear stuff. And the most important thing to remember when you're doing these kinds of problems is that you persist. That you, even if you don't figure it out the first time, keep trying until you do. Of course, the big hint right now is to look for that 0 row because it tells you whether you're adding or subtracting. Thanks.